We are so used to our streets as they are today. But have you ever wondered what they were like in years gone by? Who were the people who lived and worked here? What was the atmosphere like? How have they changed? I hope to answer some of these questions. Let me begin with the story of one of our central streets. It's not the largest street, it's not the most important street today, but it is one that has witnessed many interesting events over the years. This is the story of Irish Town. The street formed part of the original Moorish city of Gibraltar, which nestled under the emblematic Moorish castle. It was probably from that time that the street acquired its particular shape. Gibraltar was finally taken from the Moors in 1462 by the Conde de Niebla, who was additionally appointed Duke of Medina Sidonia. It happened on the feast of St. Bernard, whose image is venerated here in the Cathedral of St. Mary the Crowned. The street then acquired its first name, La Calle de Santa Ana, St. Anne Street. The name St. Anne Street, Calle de Santa Ana, is because the Spaniards built a chapel here dedicated to St. Anne, here at the corner of Market Lane and Irish Town. It was later expanded into a church by the Mercedarian order, and they built a friary alongside. It was known as La Merced. Even today, this is known as El Patio de la Merced. This is one of the original 16th century columns of the Mercedarian convent in its original position. The best evocation of this once grand Mercedarian convent is here in this wine bar and restaurant, where we can still see two of the columns in their original location. And they're particularly important because the distance between one column and the other shows us the width of the original patio. The Mercedarian convent gave its name to this imposing house that was built in 1899, Cloister Building. It also gave its name to this short lane, Cloister Ramp. With the arrival of the British in the early 18th century, the Mercedarian church and the convent were abandoned by the friars. They then became offices for the Admiralty and accommodation for the clerks. But this was not the only convent on Irish Town or close to it. This is the site of the convent of St. Clare. El Convento de Santa Clara. It was a Franciscan nunnery, and indeed the only nunnery in Gibraltar in Spanish times. At the time, you had a small square here off the main street at the top of the lane, and the church faced onto the square. And then next to the church was the convent itself. The convent also had a garden, and it extended from round about this sort of area right down to Irish Town itself. So this building, which is now a coffee shop and restaurant, the entire building, that formed part of the original garden of El Convento de Santa Clara. When an Anglo-Dutch force took Gibraltar in August 1704, some of the Spanish inhabitants stayed behind, and they would have continued to call this La Calle de Santa Ana, St. Anne Street, because the British did not immediately rename the streets of Gibraltar. Here, at number 12, on the keystone above the door, is a representation of a woman with a halo. Possibly, it represents St. Anne, after whom Irish Town was first named. By the time of the 1727 siege, some new street names were becoming established. This is Crotchet's Ramp, but in the 18th century, the early 18th century, it was known as Portuguese Town because a number of Portuguese people lived here. And at this time, the name town and street were almost synonymous. It was at about this time that the name Irish Town first began to be used. So if Portuguese Town, Crotchet's Ramp, was named after the Portuguese, who were the Irish? If we look at the records of the garrison of Gibraltar in the early 18th century, we find that there's no Irish regiment stationed here. So the name Irish Town cannot be related to the military. There were a couple of Irish families that settled in Gibraltar in the early 18th century. They included the Lynch family, after whom this lane is named, and the Butler family. But neither of them lived in Irish Town. So they can be eliminated from the list. That leaves one major possibility. It's well known that when the siege of 1727 ended, there were problems in the garrison. The soldiers now had a lot of time on their hands, and as a result, they became unruly, they became ill-disciplined, and in particular, they were prone to drunkenness. So it was decided that what they needed was female company. So 2 shiploads of Irish women were sent out to Gibraltar. The first arrived on the 29th of October 1727, the second in January 1728. And I have no doubt that here on this street is where the Irish women took up residence. So the street became known as Irish Town, first of all because you had Irish people living here, but also, equally important, so that the soldiers would know where they could find the Irish women who were plying their trade. So in the late 1720s and into the 1730s and 1740s, this street acquired a reputation as a street of ill repute. Why were Irish women sent to Gibraltar? Why Irish? Recent studies suggest that the British treated the Irish Catholics very badly indeed in the 17th and 18th centuries. Catholic Irish men were sent as slaves to the Caribbean plantations. They were cheaper than black African slaves. So it is hardly surprising that Catholic Irish women should have been sent to Gibraltar as prostitutes. Spare a thought for them and what they went through the next time you're in Irish Town. When Sir Humphrey Bland took over as governor in 1749, a lot of things changed. He established order and established procedures for business to be conducted in Gibraltar, and he established regulations. So I rather suspect that it was at that time that the ladies of the night ceased to ply their trade in Irish Town. After all, Irish Town was too valuable. It was next to the cooperage. It was ideally placed for business. It had potential for trade, and so it was a place that was too valuable for the brothels. The original Irish Town was shorter than the street that we call Irish Town today. It only extended as far as Market Lane, the junction with Market Lane, and from that junction to John Mackintosh Square, this section of street, which is wider and therefore you can see it's completely different from the much narrower original Irish Town, this was known as Market Street. And the market in question was the Meat Market, which stood where the Victorian Police Station stands today. And colloquially, it was known as El Zoco. And this is using the Hispanized version of the Arabic word souk, which means market. The Zoco gave its name to a later British defence work here close to Irish Town. I'm standing on Zocca Flank, where the Catholic Community Centre was built in 1969. So the British called this Zocca Flank because they don't really have a great facility with foreign languages, and they just mangled the name Zoco and altered it to Zocca. Properly, this should have been known as Zoco Flank. In the 18th century, meat had to be imported into Gibraltar in the form of live animals. There were then, of course, no fridges, and there was no way of keeping meat. So the animals had to be slaughtered and sold, the meat sold, immediately after and before it could go off. So you can imagine the scene here in the Zoco in the 18th century. The sounds of the animals being slaughtered, the smells of the place, and the sound of the butchers shouting their wares. It really was quite an unsavory place, what with the flies, and on top of all that, the butchers used to throw their waste over the sea wall into the sea. In the 18th century, the sea used to come right up to the wall just here behind me. The line wall was, in fact, a sea wall. Just outside the wall were rocks, and beyond the rocks was a breakwater. So when the butchers used to throw their waste over the wall, it tended to get trapped between the sea wall and the breakwater, particularly at low tide. So in the summer, the smell would have been absolutely appalling. And so were the flies. They would attend daily at the feast. The result of this was that at the end of the 18th century, General O'Hara, when he was governor, decided that the slaughterhouse and the meat market had to be moved. And he built a new slaughterhouse on the neutral ground. The location of the slaughterhouse in the 19th century was in this area, where the Motor Vehicle Test Centre is today. Here, there was no longer a nuisance. All the waste could now be thrown into the sea at Eastern Beach. In spite of the nuisance represented by El Zoco, the meat market, there were a number of grand houses along Market Street. The corner house of Market Street with Commercial Square, as it was then known, was owned by John Dominic Grana in the middle of the 18th century. The house burnt down in 1747, and then advantage was taken to shorten it, because the original house used to jut right out into the square. And it was then decided that the rebuilt house would be in line with the other buildings and create a regular square. And the house stood out because it was painted in yellow after it was rebuilt. This is Cooperage Lane. It's at the northern end of Irish Town. The old cooperage, after which the lane takes its name, was situated right here where the ICC stands today. And the cooperage in the 18th century was absolutely essential for a wide range of purposes. It was where barrels were made and repaired, and barrels were used for the storage of water, wine, food, for a whole range of products, and of course for everything that was imported or exported by sea. The barrels that were repaired at the cooperage came in all shapes and sizes. Here at the headquarters of Sir Conan Speed, we can see one of the larger barrels, a hogshead. This one is actually imprinted in the front with the name James Speed, and it's a 19th century barrel. In fact, tobacco was also imported into Gibraltar in this size barrel. The entrance into the cooperage was eventually from here, where the fish market was later established. A gate was cut into the seawall in 1792 by Lieutenant General Sir Robert Boyd, and his name is recorded on the underside of the keystone above the door. When Boyd's gate was opened, the wall behind me was solid. It was the sea wall. The arch came much later. It was at the time when a bridge was built across Orange Bastion to take a road, which is now Linewall Road, right across. And it was the Sanitary Commissioners of Gibraltar who created this arch in 1903. And they put their initials there, SCG. It's the only evocation that we have of the Sanitary Commissioners in Gibraltar today. Here behind me is number 6 Convent Place. The building was erected by the Sanitary Commissioners when the body was created in 1865. It was their headquarters. In due course, the Sanitary Commissioners were abolished in 1924 when the City Council was created. But let's get back now to the 18th century. The new character of Irishtown, after the Irish women had left, is represented by the presence here of one of the 4 Gibraltar synagogues. This was built in 1759. It is known colloquially as La Snoga Chica, or the small synagogue. It is Etz Chaim, the gate of heaven. Under Article 10 of the Treaty of Utrecht, there is a sentence that says that no Jews or Moors should live in Gibraltar. So the Jewish community kept a discreet, low profile. There is another synagogue close to Irishtown. It is situated here on Parliament Lane, and it has an equally discreet frontage onto the street. This is the interior of the Abu Dharam Synagogue. It dates from 1821. And it is an absolute gem. It's beautifully looked after, and it is decorated with a number of silver votive lamps and chandeliers. They're echoes of the families that have worshipped here over the last 200 years almost.
The fellow who bought the synagogue was called Samuel. He bought it with his brother Abraham, and I believe Abraham was the father of my direct 4th great-grandfather, Joseph Avram Abu Dharam. And it was in their tradition to found synagogues because they did it in Spain from the medieval times. They then continued to do so in Gibraltar, and then even afterwards they founded charitable institutions in Tetuan, which is where the family originally came from. I think the other thing I would like to say about the synagogue building is that it was, of course, in Castilian times reputed to have been the municipality, the city hall. And it's quite interesting that you see the thread continuing of public service. Firstly, as a city hall to the people of Gibraltar in a civilian capacity, then in a private religious capacity, and today obviously in a public capacity, which arose, the synagogue, although it was a private synagogue initially, became a public building in 1820 and has continued since then, and long may it continue.
In the second half of the 18th century, Freemasons would gather in order to parley in the street behind me. And they gave the name to the street, Parliament Lane. So the name, in fact, does not have any political significance. Earlier than that, the lane was known as Calwell's Lane, after Mr. Calwell, who had a property at the top corner of Parliament Lane with Main Street, and he was an innkeeper and tavern keeper. Calwell's Lane is not the only street name in this area that has been lost. This short spur coming off Irish Town used to be called Parliament Ramp. It's now a section of Parliament Lane. And this section is significant for another reason, because it shows us the difference in height between the original street level of Irish Town and the height of the old sea wall, which can be seen peeping up behind Lyne Wall. Lyne Wall Road, of course, was only created in the 20th century. So the houses in the 18th century, which were mainly either a single story or they had a ground floor and a first floor, if they were close to the sea wall, could have a reasonable amount of protection from any attacker from the seaward side. But there was a downside to this section of the city. Because it was so low-lying, when it rained very hard, the area was prone to flooding. When Irish Town acquired a commercial character, a solution had to be found to the problem of flooding, and the merchants came up with just the right idea. They decided to place their stores on the first floor of a building rather than on the ground floor, so that their merchandise would not be damaged. And what you had was a winch to enable the goods to be hoisted up from street level into the store. There's one very good example of an original winch here in the middle of the street. You had a grill protecting the entrance to make sure no one would fall out into the street, and inside you had a double door which opened up and allowed the goods to come in and out of the warehouse. This brings us to the development of Irish Town in the early 19th century, when the street acquired its reputation as the principal commercial street in Gibraltar. It was all due to the impact of Napoleon Bonaparte's blockade of Britain. Napoleon chose to try and impede the export of British goods into Europe. So he closed the ports of France and Spain to British exports, which were vital to the United Kingdom at the time. Gibraltar was a port that was still open for British goods, so it acquired an enormous importance because it was through Gibraltar that exports from the UK were channeled. Millions of pounds worth of goods were stored in the warehouses in Irish Town. Millions of pounds in those days. So we're talking about billions of pounds today. It was the commercial heyday of Gibraltar, and at the center of it all lay Irish Town. It was also in the early 19th century that Irish Town acquired the look that it has today. And the person to whom we can attribute that more than anybody else is John Marie Boschetti. And it's bizarre that Boschetti should be remembered today only by a narrow flight of steps that bears his name, Boschetti's Steps. Now, John Marie Boschetti was an architect. He was born in Milan, and he came to Gibraltar shortly after the Great Siege of 1779 to 1783. He was in great demand, and he built a number of emblematic buildings, including, for example, the Victualling Yard at Rosia. Now, he made a lot of money, and some of that money he invested in property. He bought the entire land that had once been El Convento de Santa Clara, St. Clare's Convent, which stretched from Main Street all the way down to Irish Town. and he built a series of townhouses there. And if we take the corner house as an example, we can view the different elements that make up a Boschetti-style house. Let us look at a house from the bottom upwards. I'm standing underground in a water cistern. As from the time of General Don, when he was Lieutenant Governor of Gibraltar from 1815 through to 1831, he passed a law which required every person building a house in Gibraltar to place a cistern underground and to collect water from the roofs of the property and store it in the cistern so there'd be enough rainwater for all the people living in the house. So over here, it's very unusual because normally as these cisterns are underground, it's very difficult to actually see one of them. But this particular one is open to the public, and we can study the different elements of a water cistern. First of all, a cistern tended to be rectangular in size. The inside tended to be whitewashed every few years in order to keep the water that it collected pure. And then you had an inspection hatch. The inspection hatch was important for two reasons. First of all, you could check to see whether there was a lot of water in the cistern and therefore you had to close it off. Or you could also check to see whether there was too little water and whether you needed to panic and try and make alternative arrangements to get your drinking water. The ground floor of a house designed by Boschetti typically had a series of arches. You had arched doors and more often than not arched windows, although some of the windows were rectangular in shape. Behind these doors and windows you had small commercial premises and then a patio. Then on the upper floors, Boschetti introduced wooden shutters which were in a Genoese style. These were made by specialist shuttering carpenters, and the feature of these wooden shutters that needs to be particularly highlighted is the flap that they had, which could be cantilevered up. This meant that you could have the shutters closed with the cantilevered parts opened, allowing plenty of ventilation but preventing the sun from coming into a room and making it hot in the long summer days. At night, wooden shutters would be placed against the windows of shops, and these shutters were fitted in place with a series of 3 pins. Now this is the only window, it's here in Parliament Lane, which shows the 3 pin holes in their original location. There's 1, 2 and 3. Another element favoured by Boschetti were Regency-style balconies, like we have here, where we have 2 balconies, one above the other. The rhythm of arches so beloved of Boschetti was universal in Gibraltar, but it has been lost almost totally along Main Street and can now only be appreciated here in Irish Town and in Governors Street. Boschetti was not the only influence on Gibraltar's architectural vernacular. We also owe a tribute to the Portuguese craftsmen and traditions, and it's very much in the Portuguese style to place tiles on the outside of a building. There's some very fine facades along Irish Town which have been tiled. If we look closely at the buildings here on Irish Town, we can see some of the original Victorian features. Here at number 95, we have a Victorian door knocker. It's a traditional design. It's in the shape of a hand clutching a ball, which strikes a plate directly below it. And when you knocked using this door knocker, you made quite a terrific sound, and it could be heard in the deepest recesses of the house, as I'll show you. And you can also see here the hooks on which the shutters on this particular window were fixed at night when the place was being secured. Today, we associate number 95 Irish Town with Panorama newspaper. But there was an earlier newspaper that was published at this very premises, and that was El Anunciador. This was a newspaper which was born towards the end of the 19th century and was owned by the Ferrari family. And it fell victim to the Second World War and closed in 1940. At that point, Nicomedes Ferrari closed down the newspaper, possibly because of the evacuation. In later years, this was also the site of the publication of the Gibraltar Post and the Gibraltar Evening Post. This is an old, original Victorian door at number 92. Now, in the Victorian period, a door was never locked during the day. You can see the size of the keyhole, and that gives you a good indication of the size of the key. Not all members of the family had a copy of the key. So, in order to keep the door secured, but yet accessible to members of the family, there was a system called a latch. Now, the latch would open by inserting a T-shaped bar into here, and this would lift up a little flap, and then the door would open. But the lock mechanism of this door is still here on the back of the door, and it really is quite a dramatic size. The most important building of the Victorian period on Irish Town is undoubtedly the police station, which, when it was built, was called the Police Office. It was erected in 1864 at the time when General Codrington was governor, and there's a tablet above the entrance that records this. The police office was designed by Walter Elliot, who also built the post office. Now, the design is very much in the neo-Gothic style. It was very much in fashion at the time, and other buildings in the neo-Gothic style in Gibraltar are the Sacred Heart Church and the new facade that was added to the convent, the governor's residence. That was also red brick, like the police station here. When the police station was built, a most unusual feature was incorporated. It was the residence of a police inspector. This meant that there was a police presence here 24 hours a day. You can tell which was the house of the inspector and which was the police station from the windows. The police station windows are very large. Those of the residents were much smaller, much narrower. And in due course, when the demands on policing grew, it was necessary for the police inspector to move out so that the police station could expand and take over the additional space. In the early 1970s, in an attempt to beautify this area, and the police station in particular, 6 large earthenware pots were placed here between the arches, but they didn't last long for a particular reason. A joker decided to plant marijuana seeds in those pots, and when they started to grow, it was a great embarrassment to the police station, and so not only were the plants removed, so were the pots. A particular feature of the police station is the stone with which it was built, because it is not the Gibraltar limestone, it's actually Maltese limestone. Limestone was brought from Malta for building the Sacred Heart Church and was also used here. They're the only examples of Maltese limestone here in Gibraltar. And the problem with the limestone is that the Maltese limestone crumbles much more than the Gibraltar one, and therefore there's a difficulty with the conservation of the building. What we call today the Magistrates' Court was originally the police court, and the courtroom was here on the first floor of the police station. Now, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was an almighty row between the colonial secretary of the day and his chief clerk. And as a result, the chief clerk was transferred to the police office. He was also the registrar of births, deaths and marriages, so he brought responsibility for those with him here to the police station. So from that point onwards, all births, deaths and marriages were registered here at the police office. So that is the origin of the phrase which the old-timers still use in Gibraltar to describe a civil marriage, when they say that a person is being married by the police, casado por la policía. Those who remember the police station in the 1960s will recall that just here there used to be a blue board, and on it it would indicate whether bathing was permitted at Eastern Beach, Catalan Bay and Sandy Bay. And most people used to come round here to check before going round to the east side to see on a Levanta day whether it was possible to swim or not on the east side. In the Victorian period, the building next to the police station was the public baths. There were two separate entrances, two separate doors. One led to the ladies' baths and the other to the men's baths. Inside, there was also a choice of bath. You could either have a hot or a cold bath, and you could have either fresh water or salt water. Obviously, the price varied depending on what you chose. So the cold saltwater bath was the cheapest. Now, in due course, when the bathhouse was no longer necessary because everyone had started to build bathrooms in their own properties, the bathhouse became part of the police station, and it was taken over by the immigration department. And in due course, it became the premises for the Royal Gibraltar Regiment Association, which is what it is today. Here in the patio behind what is now the Royal Gibraltar Regiment Association premises is a reminder of the former use of this site by the police department, because here are the old police cells. Somebody famous who was kept in these cells was the writer Laurie Lee. He's best known for having written Cider with Rosie, but he also wrote a travel book about his experiences when traveling in Andalusia. It's called As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning. And he came to Gibraltar, and he was picked up as a vagrant and spent a night here. He was not amused, and as a result, as is to be expected, his account of Gibraltar is not exactly glowing. Opposite the police station was the residence and the business premises of one of the most important merchants of the Victorian period. He was Jerome Sacconi. Sacconi was a banker, and he became the largest private banker in Gibraltar in his lifetime. But he was more than that. He was also a ship chandler and a wine merchant. And he supplied the US Navy with wines and spirits. His testimonials book has survived, and it is in the hands of Sacconi & Speed, the firm which bears his name, which was founded in 1839.
The book as such, I mean, it has a historical value, but I don't think it just has a historical value for the company. It also has a historical value for Gibraltar. And we keep this very, very safe, and it isn't generally shown to the general public. But for us, it gives us an insight into how business was developed, the resourcefulness of Jerome Sacconi in actually getting these testimonials, because it showed that he realized that the best way to actually get additional business from the American fleet was to actually have the recommendations of the people he'd actually served before. And by doing that, it helped develop the business. If we go to somewhere a bit later, that we have this recommendation, but it is from the United States Naval Depot in Hong Kong. And by now we're talking about September 1872. So obviously it wasn't just a question of him supplying the areas around Gibraltar, but his recommendations were coming from vessels that had visited Gibraltar, were now stationed around the different ports that formed part of the British garrison around the world. Sacconi, in his business, and James Speed, they started their businesses at some point or the other in Irish Town. And initially, Sacconi used to say that he was opposite what were the old baths, and many people will now know those premises as where the GFSB have their premises in Irish Town, and even the Gibraltar Regiments Club. So it's opposite those premises where the origins were, where the first businesses started off. And then in later letterheads, it refers to the police station, so a central police station that was in Irish Town. But for us, Irish Town has a very, it's symbolic because it's the origins of where this business started. And 2.5 years ago, we decided that we wanted to re-explore our origins in Irish Town, and that's why we opened a specialist wine and spirit shop, which is called The Cellar, on the corner of Parliament Lane in Irish Town.
There is another side to the character of Irish Town, a mysterious side. Many people have walked past number 33 and looked in and seen this large, beautiful glass fanlight and a painted ceiling in the Mudéjar style, and speculated about what this building originally housed. Some have thought it was a hotel, some have thought it was some kind of entertainment place. And they were right up to a point, because this was the Salon Ideal. In the late 19th century, it was a music hall, and it also became the first cinema in Gibraltar. The very first silent movies were screened here, and they were accompanied by a pianist who would play live music on the piano. When the Salon Ideal was in its twilight years after the First World War, 2 buildings were rebuilt in this part of Irish Town, and they were built in a particularly distinctive style because they blended an element of late Art Nouveau together with traditional Gibraltar features. So you have, on the one hand, a tiled facade, you have stone, but you also have cement, a new material, and you have concrete pilasters surmounted by Corinthian columns, which are very traditional, but worked in a new 20th century style. And you have putti, which have almost a Renaissance feel. So it's really quite a mix of different styles and features that can be seen on these buildings. The patio of the house at number 32 still retains its original configuration right down to the ground floor. So you see, as you come in through the entranceway, the beautiful tiles on either side of the passageway, and then the patio. And the patio was important because it is a light well, right from the very top of the building right down, providing ventilation and light for the rooms on the upper floors, which do not face out onto the street. And these buildings on the west side of Irish Town are particularly distinctive because they have 2 fronts and no backs. They have a frontage onto Irish Town and a frontage onto Linewall Road. And in fact, this particular building has the date on the Linewall side. It is 1925. The other building of the 1920s is number 27, which is opposite number 32 and not quite as grand, but it does share some features. So you have the same white tiled facade and the same cement pilasters, but the capitals are different. They are Ionic on number 27 and much grander Corinthian capitals on number 32. When walking along Irish Town, indeed when walking along anywhere in the old city of Gibraltar, it's very important to look up, because failure to do so means that many details will just not be appreciated. And when you look up, then you start to ask questions when you see things that are surprising. So here on Irish Town, if you look up opposite the building at number 65, you see that there is a gap between buildings. And I'm told that the reason for this is that when the house was being redeveloped on the west side of the street, the tenant on the east side decided that he did not want to have his view from his upper windows impeded. He wanted to have better light, and so what he did was that he bought the space above the first floor, so that when the house was built opposite him, the new house, it created this gap through which he continued to have a view out over the rooftops. During much of the latter half of the 20th century, Irish Town was a particularly busy street when it came to traffic. There was an incessant amount of traffic both day and night, and on top of that you had parked cars parked along the entire length of the street. Add to that the fact that you had a number of bars that catered to a Royal Navy clientele. You found that at night there were many sailors out and about. Behind me was the old Fox and Hounds, it's now something else. And you had other bars that catered for the Royal Navy. Many a fight took place here between drunken sailors. But then by the 1980s, early 1980s, things were changing. The Royal Navy presence was declining, and it was a time when change was in the air, and it was the right time to press for change. So the initiative began to grow to have the street pedestrianised. And at the forefront of that was Patrick Saccarello.
Well, Saccarello Coffee Shop opened in 1985, and we quickly realized, my brother and I, that if we wanted to develop the business and attract more tourists and locals, we had to sort of get rid of the traffic. And we did a survey and found that most people were using the street to park, to go to the bank or a shop or something, but it was like a motorway, and so we formed an association. Orlando Yates was one of the prime movers, and the association's aim was to pedestrianise the street, to try and regenerate the street and create a more touristic ambiance for the street. And so we went round traders and asked them to support a campaign to pedestrianise the street. And at a meeting of the Development and Planning Commission, I remember we put it to the Commission under the Honourable Adolfo Canepa whether they would pedestrianise the street. And as we had the backing of so many traders, they eventually agreed to it, as they felt the way forward was for Irish Town was to develop touristically. In the same way that in the mid-80s, we felt that to develop the street and create the right atmosphere for more tourists and visitors to come to Irish Town, and for the street to develop in the leisure way. Recently, some traders I spoke to in Irish Town felt that with so many areas in Gibraltar cropping up, promoting themselves, Casemates, Main Street, Chatham Countermount, Ocean Village, and so many different areas, that we felt that government really wasn't doing enough to sort of promote the tourist potential of Irish Town, the old commercial street. And so, following a petition to the Chief Minister, he kindly put us in contact with the Tourist Board, and they kindly agreed to distribute this proposed brochure, which John Langdon and Richard Garcia and I eventually put together. And I'm pleased to say this brochure, I think, is going to get Irish Town more tourist exposure, more awareness by locals of the history, its commercial and architectural heritage, and I think it's, along with Main Street and Casemates, can be the sort of main attraction of the old town. We complement Main Street and Casemates.
When the Duke of Kent visited Gibraltar a number of years ago, one of the stops on his visit was to Irish Town, and he came here because he was attracted by the history of the street and by its heritage. And later on, in due course, the street was indeed pedestrianised, and that made a huge difference. And then, even later, the street was cobbled. The original cobbles on Irish Town in the early 20th century had been wood. Now there were stone cobbles, but the street was beautified. So there were planters, there were benches put out. So the character of the street had changed. In addition, a number of cafes and restaurants sprang up. Some of them had outside tables, so al fresco wining and dining became a possibility. The street had reinvented itself. Irish Town was now a completely different proposition to what it had been at the beginning of the 20th century. It was now a leisure hub, as well as being the focus of a number of quality shops. So we find that Irish Town has gone a long way since it was La Calle de Santa Ana in the Spanish days, and is now one of the principal leisure streets in Gibraltar.
Call me lush, panorama, Santa Ana, wind rap. Drink a hand up in blankets and a man's till she tell her friends. The future wrapped in the floats of cherubim. Downtown South Philly, general, wild gentleman. Cause I don't blame it on the alcohol, I blame it on the Adderall. Blow coke, smoke dope, have a ball. Used to rock a snapback, relaxing in the Palomar. Looking inside the tea leaf, praying to see the calendar. Half Laura Kenya, half rap, supreme magic ball. The lamb open, the seventh seal, reveal Babylon. Rapadon, Sway Tims, Coney Island, Gravitron. 1983, the singularity's a marathon. Now we on to stranger days, twerking bitches and hitting switches for stranger ways. Here we come and she always look like a golden age. No more golden days, stay pushed forward, fast forward, clap the olden ways. East to Rocky Erickson, east to Bo Derek. So lost in the television, walk with the elephants to die by their relatives. Lush life, Holy Ghost.